James Jimmy Patterson froze mid-stride, his coffee cup slipping from trembling fingers as he watched the impossible scene unfolding before him. The injured German shepherd he'd bought for $10 3 months ago was dragging an unconscious elderly woman through rising floodwater, blood streaming from the dog's reopened leg wound with each desperate step. This wasn't some ordinary rescue dog. This was a warrior refusing to abandon his mission. The gathered crowd gasped collectively as Kaiser stumbled, nearly dropping Eleanor Thornton's limp form, then regained his footing with grim determination. Children pressed against their parents' legs, wide-eyed witnesses to raw courage. The metallic scent of blood mixed with muddy water filled the air. Jimmy's mind flashed to that terrible day in Kandahar, when his canine partner Rex had made the same sacrifice, choosing duty over self-preservation, choosing another's life over his own safety. "Get the medics now!" someone screamed, but Jimmy was already running, his own PTSD forgotten in the face of Kaiser's heroism. How had a worthless dog become the bravest soul in Millbrook County? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, James Jimmy Patterson had been a different man entirely, though he wouldn't have called himself a man at all back then. At 34, the former Army sergeant carried himself like someone apologizing for taking up space, his broad shoulders permanently hunched forward as if bracing for the next blow life might deliver. The Purple Heart, gathering dust in his trailer's junk drawer, meant nothing when you couldn't sleep through the night without seeing Rex's torn body in your dreams. His German Shepherd partner had died saving Jimmy's unit from an IED blast in Afghanistan's Kandahar province, and the survivor's guilt had followed him home like a shadow that grew longer each passing day. Millbrook, Tennessee wasn't much to look at. A fading town of 8,000 souls nestled between rolling hills where tobacco once grew and auto plants once hummed with prosperity. Now, it was the kind of place young people fled and old-timers clung to, sustained by stubborn pride and Sunday church attendance. The trailer park where Jimmy had landed after his medical discharge sat on the outskirts, a collection of aluminum boxes housing society's forgotten. Retired factory workers, single mothers, and veterans like himself who'd traded their combat boots for minimum-wage uniforms. Jimmy's particular demons had cost him 3 jobs in 18 months. Panic attacks at the Walmart loading dock, flashbacks triggered by a forklift's beeping at the lumberyard. The night terrors that left him screaming his dead partner's name had driven away his girlfriend, his few remaining friends, and finally, his self-respect. Now he owed $23,000 in back rent, medical bills, and credit card debt, numbers that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the hope he had of paying them. His VA disability check barely covered ramen noodles and the cheapest beer at Murphy's gas station. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd survived roadside bombs and Taliban ambushes only to be defeated by civilian life's quiet brutalities, overdue notices, employment applications, and the suffocating silence of a world that had moved on without him. Every morning, Jimmy stared at the photograph pinned to his bathroom mirror, Rex sitting at attention beside their Humvee, both of them young and confident and believing they were invincible. The dog's intelligent brown eyes seemed to judge him across the years, asking why Jimmy had survived when the better soul had died. On that September morning, when everything changed, Jimmy had $47 to his name and a broken porch step that would probably get him evicted if he didn't fix it soon. The county fair's weekend flea market seemed like his best shot at finding cheap tools, though every dollar spent felt like a betrayal of more pressing needs. He'd driven his rusted pickup truck through town, past the Methodist church where Eleanor May Thornton was practicing hymns, past Dr. Sarah Beth Coleman's veterinary clinic, past all the normal lives that seemed as foreign to him as the moon. Jimmy Patterson was just trying to make it through another day without falling completely apart. He had no idea that fate was waiting for him in the form of a limping dog and a cynical old trainer with secrets of his own. The September morning air carried the scent of fried funnel cake and diesel exhaust as Jimmy navigated through the crowded flea market behind Millbrook High School's football stadium. Vendors had set up their folding tables at dawn, hawking everything from hand-quilted blankets to rusted farm equipment. The cacophony of haggling voices and children's laughter should have been comforting, but it only amplified the ringing in Jimmy's ears, a souvenir from too many explosions half a world away. He'd come looking for a socket wrench set, something cheap enough to fix his trailer's collapsing porch steps before his landlord found another excuse to evict him. $47 burned in his wallet like a guilty secret. Money that should have gone toward groceries or the phone bill that was already 2 weeks overdue. Jimmy was examining a box of mismatched tools when he heard it, a low, pained whimper that cut through the market noise like a blade through silk. The sound triggered something primal in him, a recognition that bypassed his rational mind and went straight to his gut. He'd heard that exact sound before in the mountains of Afghanistan when wounded soldiers tried to stay quiet despite their agony. Following the sound, Jimmy pushed through a cluster of elderly women debating the merits of ceramic roosters until he reached the far edge of the market. There, in the shadow of a rusted pickup truck, sat a German shepherd that looked like the ghost of better days. The dog was massive even while sitting, with the distinctive black and tan coloring that had made the breed famous in military and police work. But this animal bore the unmistakable marks of hard living, ribs visible through patchy fur, a torn left ear that suggested violent encounters, and most heartbreaking of all, a rear leg that he held at an unnatural angle, the paw barely touching the ground. Despite his obvious pain and malnourishment, the dog's posture remained alert, dignified. His dark eyes swept the crowd with the methodical precision of a sentry, missing nothing. When those eyes found Jimmy's, something electric passed between them, a recognition that Jimmy couldn't name but felt in his bones. "You interested or just gawking?" The voice belonged to a stocky man in his 50s, wearing a faded army jacket that had seen better decades. His name tag read Williams, and his weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who'd spent his life training animals. This had to be Marcus "Tank" Williams, though Jimmy had never seen him around Millbrook before. "What happened to him?" Jimmy asked, nodding toward the dog. Tank's expression hardened. "Life happened. Dog can't hunt, can't guard worth a damn, and that leg ain't getting any better. He's eating me out of house and home, and I got no use for dead weight." He spat tobacco juice into a paper cup. "You want him or not? $10 takes him off my hands." $10. Jimmy had spent more than that on a single beer at the VFW just last week. But $10 was also a day's worth of meals when you were choosing between food and keeping the lights on. "What's his name?" Jimmy found himself asking. "Don't matter what I call him. You buy him, you name him whatever you want." Tank's dismissive tone carried an edge of something that might have been pain, quickly buried under gruff indifference. "Clock's ticking, son. I got other customers." Jimmy looked back at the German shepherd, who was watching this exchange with the patient stillness of an old soldier accustomed to having his fate decided by others. There was something in the animal's bearing that reminded Jimmy achingly of Rex, not just the breed, but a quality of alertness that spoke of extensive training and hard-won experience. "Can't hunt, you said?" "Useless as tits on a bull." Tank crossed his arms. "Dog's got more problems than a math book. You'd be doing him a favor putting him down, but I ain't got the heart for it. Figure somebody else might want to try their luck." The casual cruelty in those words made Jimmy's jaw clench. He'd heard similar dismissals from VA doctors who looked at broken veterans and saw only liability and expense. The idea of this proud animal being reduced to dead weight by someone who should have understood the cost of service struck him as profoundly wrong. "I'll take him." The words were out of Jimmy's mouth before his rational mind could intervene. Tank raised an eyebrow. "Just like that. Don't you want to see how he moves? Test his temperament?" "I can see enough." Jimmy pulled out his wallet and counted out 10 crumpled bills. As he handed over the money, nearly a quarter of everything he had left in the world, he felt a strange mixture of terror and rightness, as if he were stepping off a cliff and growing wings simultaneously. Tank pocketed the cash and untied a frayed rope from his truck's bumper. "Your funeral, buddy. Don't come crying to me when he dies on you." The first 3 nights were hell for both of them. Jimmy had led the German Shepherd to his trailer using the frayed rope, the dog moving with a careful, measured gait that spoke of chronic pain and hard-earned wariness. Inside the cramped space that Jimmy called home, the animal had immediately claimed the corner farthest from the door, settling down with his back to the wall and his eyes fixed on every possible exit. Jimmy had offered food, a can of expired beef stew mixed with the last of his generic dog kibble, but the shepherd had only sniffed it before turning away. Water was accepted with more enthusiasm, though the dog drank in quick, efficient gulps while maintaining constant surveillance of his surroundings. "I get it," Jimmy had said quietly, settling into his threadbare recliner across the narrow living room. "New place, new person. Trust has to be earned." The dog's ears had flicked at the sound of his voice, but otherwise he'd remained motionless, a living statue carved from wariness and pain. That first night, both of them had awakened screaming. Jimmy's nightmare had been the usual horror show, the Humvee exploding in slow motion, Rex's body flying through the air, the metallic taste of blood and dust. He'd jolted upright on his fold-out couch, sweat-soaked and gasping, to find the German Shepherd pressed against the far wall, panting heavily with pupils dilated in terror. They'd stared at each other across the darkness, 2 traumatized souls recognizing something fundamental in each other's breaking. Neither had gone back to sleep. By the second week, patterns had emerged. The dog, whom Jimmy had started calling Kaiser, a name that seemed to fit his regal bearing despite his circumstances, would eat only when Jimmy wasn't watching directly. He'd accepted brief touches but tensed at sudden movements. Most tellingly, he'd begun positioning himself between Jimmy and the trailer's entrance whenever anyone approached. It was during one of these protective displays that Jimmy first suspected Kaiser was more than just a well-trained pet. Mrs. Henderson from 2 trailers over had knocked on Jimmy's door, complaining about late-night noise from his television. Jimmy had been explaining that he kept the volume low when Kaiser had suddenly moved. Not the casual repositioning of a house dog, but the precise, fluid motion of a trained guardian placing himself at the optimal angle to intercept a potential threat. The stance was unmistakably military. Balanced weight distribution, eyes tracking multiple vectors, ready to respond to command or situation with equal efficiency. Jimmy had seen that exact posture dozens of times in Afghanistan, employed by dogs worth more than most soldiers' annual salaries. "Easy, boy," Jimmy had murmured, and Kaiser had immediately sat. Not the casual sit of a pet, but the crisp, controlled position of a working animal awaiting orders. Mrs. Henderson had eyed Kaiser nervously and left without further complaint. The real revelation came 3 weeks after Jimmy's impulsive purchase, during what should have been a routine trip to Murphy's gas station. Jimmy had been reaching for a 6-pack of beer when the fluorescent lights had started flickering. A malfunction that transformed the store's familiar interior into something that looked disturbingly like the strobing emergency lighting of a military compound under attack. The flashback hit him like a physical blow. Suddenly, Jimmy wasn't in rural Tennessee but back in Kandahar, hearing the whistle of incoming mortars and the sharp crack of sniper fire. His vision tunneled. His breathing became labored, and his hands began to shake uncontrollably. Kaiser's response was immediate and professional. The dog moved between Jimmy and the store's other customers, creating a protective buffer while simultaneously applying deep pressure therapy, leaning his substantial weight against Jimmy's legs in a way that provided grounding and stability. When Jimmy's knees buckled, Kaiser was there, solid and warm and reassuringly real. More remarkably, the dog began a systematic scan of the store's interior, checking corners and sight lines with the methodical precision of a bomb detection specialist. His nose worked the air in patterns that Jimmy recognized from countless security sweeps, and his ears swiveled independently to isolate and categorize sounds. This wasn't instinct. This was training, extensive, professional, military-grade training. The episode lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. When Jimmy's vision cleared and his breathing steadied, he found Kaiser sitting calmly beside him, alert but relaxed, ready to respond if the situation deteriorated but not anxious in the absence of immediate threat. The teenage cashier behind the counter was staring open-mouthed. "Mister, is your dog some kind of police dog or something? I never seen nothing like that." Jimmy looked down at Kaiser, who met his gaze with dark eyes that held depths Jimmy was only beginning to fathom. "Something like that," he said quietly. That night, Jimmy sat on his trailer's rickety porch with Kaiser beside him, both of them watching the sun set over the hills that surrounded Millbrook. The dog's injured leg was stretched out carefully, but he seemed more relaxed than Jimmy had yet seen him. "You've got secrets, don't you, boy?" Jimmy said, running his fingers through Kaiser's coarse fur. "Lot of secrets." Kaiser's tail thumped once against the porch decking, not the enthusiastic wagging of a pet, but a single deliberate acknowledgement. Jimmy had spent enough time around military working dogs to recognize the signs: the precise obedience, the tactical awareness, the specialized training that couldn't be faked or taught by amateur handlers. Kaiser wasn't just a German shepherd with good instincts. He was a professional, a warrior in his own right, carrying his own scars from battles Jimmy could only imagine. The question that kept Jimmy awake that night wasn't how a dog like this had ended up being sold for $10 at a county fair. It was why Tank Williams had been so eager to get rid of an animal that was obviously worth thousands of dollars and represented years of intensive training. Something wasn't adding up, and Jimmy had learned in Afghanistan that when things didn't add up, people usually died. He just hadn't expected that the mystery would lead him back to his own past. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in early October, when the autumn air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the leaves had begun their slow transformation from green to gold. Jimmy was attempting to repair his trailer's sagging steps with a handful of salvaged 2x4s when Kaiser suddenly went rigid beside him. The dog's ears snapped to attention, his body dropping into a low crouch that Jimmy recognized from countless military operations. Kaiser's eyes fixed on something beyond the tree line that bordered the trailer park, his nostrils flaring as he processed scents Jimmy couldn't detect. "What is it, boy?" Jimmy whispered, instinctively reaching for the Glock he no longer carried. Old habits died hard, and the absence of that familiar weight on his hip felt like missing a limb. Kaiser's response was immediate and chilling. The dog moved with fluid precision to position himself between Jimmy and whatever had triggered his alert, then issued a single, sharp bark. Not the random woofing of an agitated pet, but the controlled warning of a trained sentinel reporting contact. From the woods emerged a figure that made Jimmy's blood run cold. A teenage boy, maybe 16, stumbling through the underbrush with the glassy-eyed confusion of someone deep in diabetic shock. The kid's face was pale and sweaty, his coordination deteriorating with each unsteady step. Jimmy recognized the signs immediately. He'd seen soldiers go down with similar symptoms after their blood sugar crashed during extended operations. But it was Kaiser's reaction that truly stunned him. Without waiting for commands, The German Shepherd moved into action with the smooth efficiency of a seasoned professional. He approached the boy in a specific pattern Jimmy remembered from medical alert dogs, circling once to assess the situation before positioning himself to provide physical support if the teenager collapsed. "Easy there, son," Jimmy called out, rising slowly to avoid spooking either the boy or the dog. "You feeling dizzy? Shaky?" The teenager's eyes rolled back briefly before focusing on Jimmy with obvious effort. I think My mom said if I ever felt like this." Kaiser was already ahead of them both. The dog had moved to the boy's left side, the optimal position to catch someone who was about to fall, and was maintaining just the right distance to provide support without adding to his confusion. "Sit down right here," Jimmy instructed, guiding the boy to a lawn chair beside his trailer. "When's the last time you ate something?" "This morning." "No, yesterday. I don't remember." The teenager's speech was becoming increasingly slurred. Jimmy ducked into his trailer and grabbed the orange juice he'd been saving for his own rough mornings, along with a package of crackers that represented a significant portion of his remaining food supply. When he emerged, he found Kaiser performing what could only be described as a medical assessment, nose working systematically over the boy, checking for additional symptoms or complications. "Drink this slowly," Jimmy said, pressing the juice into the teenager's trembling hands. Small sips. As the boy's color began to improve and his coordination stabilized, Jimmy found himself studying Kaiser with new eyes. The dog's behavior hadn't been random or instinctive. It had been textbook perfect, following protocols that took months of intensive training to master. "That's one hell of a dog you got there," the boy said, his voice stronger now. "He knew I was sick before I did." Jimmy nodded slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "Yeah, he's full of surprises." After ensuring the teenager could make it home safely, and after extracting a promise that he'd call his doctor immediately, Jimmy spent the rest of the morning conducting informal tests with Kaiser. The results were both impressive and disturbing. The dog responded flawlessly to hand signals Jimmy remembered from Afghanistan. The closed fist for stop, the flat palm for stay, the circular motion for search pattern. More unsettling, Kaiser seemed to anticipate commands before Jimmy gave them, reading subtle body language cues with an expertise that spoke of extensive tactical training. But it was the afternoon's discovery that changed everything. Jimmy had been cleaning out his storage shed, looking for anything he could sell to raise money for Kaiser's obviously needed veterinary care, when he'd found his old military gear. The duffel bag had been shoved into a corner and forgotten, but when he pulled it out, Kaiser's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The dog approached the bag with reverent care, nose working over the familiar scents of military equipment, gun oil, and the distinctive smell of canvas that had seen combat zones. When Jimmy pulled out his old tactical vest, Kaiser whined, not with distress, but with recognition. "You know this stuff, don't you?" Jimmy said quietly. "This isn't your first rodeo." Kaiser's response was to press his nose against the vest's fabric, tail wagging slowly in what Jimmy could only interpret as nostalgic appreciation. When Jimmy set the vest on the ground, Kaiser immediately moved to the position a K9 would take when his handler was gearing up for a mission, close enough to provide protection, far enough away to avoid interfering with equipment checks. The realization hit Jimmy like a physical blow. This wasn't just a well-trained dog. This was a military working dog, a professional warrior who had served in combat zones, saved lives, and earned his scars in defense of people who probably never knew his name. And someone had sold him for $10 like he was junk. The anger that surged through Jimmy was hot and pure, directed not just at Tank Williams, but at a system that could discard heroes, human or canine, when they became inconvenient or expensive to maintain. He'd seen it happen to soldiers who'd given everything only to be processed out with inadequate benefits, and minimal support. Seeing it happen to Kaiser felt like a personal betrayal of everything Jimmy had once believed about honor and loyalty. That evening, Jimmy made 2 phone calls that would change both their lives. The first was to Dr. Sarah Beth Coleman at the Millbrook Veterinary Clinic. Jimmy had driven past her practice dozens of times but never had reason to visit. He'd never owned a pet, and even if he had, veterinary bills were luxuries he couldn't afford. "Dr. Coleman, this is James Patterson. I've got a German Shepherd that needs to be seen, but I need to be up front. I can't pay much right now." There was a pause before she responded, her voice carrying the professional warmth of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "What kind of problems are we looking at, Mr. Patterson?" "Old injury to his back leg, looks like shrapnel damage, maybe from an explosion, and I think he might be a military working dog. Former military, I mean. Someone sold him to me cheap, said he was worthless, but this dog's got training I've never seen in civilian animals." Another pause, longer this time. "Bring him in tomorrow morning. We'll figure out the payment later." The second call was to the one person Jimmy knew who might have connections to the military K-9 community. His former squad leader, now Sergeant Major Pete Kowalski, stationed at Fort Campbell in Kentucky. "Jimmy, Jesus, man, it's been what, 2 years? How you holding up?" Jimmy gave him the abbreviated version of his struggles, then described Kaiser and his suspicions about the dog's background. Pete listened without interruption, asking only a few pointed questions about specific behaviors and training responses. "You need to bring that dog to someone who can scan for a microchip," Pete said finally. "All military working dogs get chipped, and if he's former military, there'll be records. Question is whether someone wanted those records to stay buried." "What do you mean?" "I mean sometimes dogs disappear from the system for reasons that ain't kosher. Dogs that get written off as KIA when they're actually captured, sold, or just abandoned." Pentagon doesn't like admitting they lose track of 4-legged heroes. Jimmy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. "You think Kaiser might be one of those?" "I think you stumbled onto something bigger than a simple pet adoption, brother. And if I'm right, there are people who won't appreciate you asking questions." That night, Jimmy sat on his porch with Kaiser pressed against his side, both of them staring out at the darkness beyond the trailer park's dim security lights. The dog's warmth was comforting, but Jimmy's mind was racing with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. If Kaiser was really a missing military working dog, then Tank Williams had lied about how he'd acquired him. That meant the animal had been stolen, sold through black market channels, or abandoned by handlers who should have protected him. Any of those scenarios suggested corruption at levels that could destroy careers and end lives. But Jimmy was also beginning to understand that his relationship with Kaiser went beyond coincidence. The dog's protective instincts, his immediate recognition of Jimmy's PTSD symptoms, his military bearing, it all pointed to an animal specifically trained to work with combat veterans. "Someone wanted us to find each other, didn't they?" Jimmy murmured, scratching behind Kaiser's ears. "Question is, whether they're friend or enemy." Kaiser's only response was to lean more heavily against Jimmy's leg, offering the silent comfort that was becoming essential to both their survival. Tomorrow would bring answers, Jimmy knew. Dr. Coleman would examine Kaiser properly, and if Pete was right about the microchip, they'd learn the dog's real identity and service record. But Jimmy also suspected that knowledge would bring dangers he wasn't prepared to face. For tonight, though, it was enough to sit with his unlikely companion and feel, for the first time since returning from Afghanistan, that he wasn't completely alone in the world. The hurricane warnings had started 3 days earlier, but nobody in Millbrook took them seriously until the power lines began snapping like guitar strings in the wind. Hurricane Delilah had been forecast to weaken before reaching Tennessee, but meteorologists hadn't counted on the storm's stubborn refusal to follow their computer models. By Thursday evening, the National Weather Service had issued its most severe warning in the county's recorded history. sustained winds of 80 miles per hour, potential flooding from the Little Tennessee River, and the very real possibility that the aging Norris Dam might fail if the storm surge exceeded capacity. Jimmy stood on his trailer's reinforced porch, watching his neighbors either board up windows or load pickup trucks with hastily packed belongings. The smart ones were heading for higher ground or the emergency shelter at Millbrook High School. The stubborn ones, and Jimmy counted himself among them, were hunkering down with batteries, bottled water, and the hope that their luck would hold one more time. Kaiser pressed against Jimmy's leg, the dog's tension evident in his rigid posture and constantly moving ears. Animals could sense atmospheric pressure changes long before humans felt them, and Kaiser's agitation had been building all day. Every few minutes he would pace to the trailer's far end and back, checking windows and doors with the methodical precision of a security sweep. "Easy, boy," Jimmy murmured, though he felt the same restless energy coursing through his own system. Storm still hours away. The lie felt hollow, even as he spoke it. The wind was already strong enough to bend the trailer park's mature oak trees at dangerous angles, and the sky had taken on that sickly green hue that tornado survivors described in their nightmares. This wasn't going to be just another thunderstorm. Jimmy's cell phone buzzed with an emergency alert. "Immediate evacuation recommended for all residents in flood-prone areas. Seek higher ground immediately." He deleted the message without reading it twice. Where was he supposed to go? The trailer was everything he owned, and his truck barely had enough gas to reach the next county. Besides, Kaiser couldn't handle the stress of an evacuation shelter. Too many people, too much noise, too many triggers for both their PTSD. That's when the call came. "Jimmy, this is Eleanor Thornton from the Methodist Church." The voice was thin but determined, fighting against static that suggested phone lines were already being affected by the storm. "I'm calling everyone in the trailer park. We've got space at the church shelter if you and your dog need somewhere safe to ride this out." Jimmy had met Eleanor exactly twice. Once when she'd brought him a casserole after learning about his financial struggles, and again when she'd quietly paid his overdue electric bill through the church's assistance program. She was 78 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and possessed the kind of unshakable faith that seemed to bend reality around her will. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Thornton, but we'll be fine here. Jimmy Patterson, don't you dare try to weather this storm in that aluminum death trap." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd raised 6 children and buried a husband after 52 years of marriage. "I've seen the weather radar, and this is going to be worse than anything we've experienced in decades." Through his trailer window, Jimmy watched his neighbor's porch furniture take flight in a gust that had to be approaching 60 miles per hour. A lawn chair crashed into the side of another trailer with enough force to dent the siding. "Mrs. Thornton, I appreciate the offer, but Kaiser doesn't do well in crowds. Too many people, too much noise. It triggers his issues." There was a pause before Eleanor spoke again, and when she did, her voice had softened with understanding. "Jimmy, that dog has been through hell just like you have. But sometimes accepting help is the bravest thing a person can do. The shelter's got a quiet room in the back where you two could have some privacy." Before Jimmy could respond, the power went out. The sudden darkness was complete and disorienting, broken only by the emergency lighting from his neighbor's generators. Kaiser immediately moved into protective position, his body warm and solid against Jimmy's legs as both of them processed this escalation. Through the phone's static, Eleanor's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Jimmy? Jimmy, are you there?" "Still here, Mrs. Thornton? I just lost power." "Then you're coming to the shelter. No arguments. I'll send someone to pick you up within the hour." Mrs. Thornton, you don't understand. What I understand is that you're a good man who's been carrying too much weight for too long, and that dog of yours has been doing the same thing. Sometimes the Lord puts people in our path who need saving, and sometimes He puts people in our path to do the saving. Tonight, you're both. The line went dead, leaving Jimmy alone with Kaiser in the wind-howled darkness of his trailer. Outside, the storm was building toward its full fury, and Jimmy could hear debris hitting his walls with increasing frequency. Tree branches scraped against his roof like skeletal fingers, and somewhere in the distance the unmistakable sound of tearing metal suggested that someone's mobile home was already coming apart. Kaiser whined softly, not with fear, but with the frustrated energy of a working dog who sensed danger but had no clear mission to fulfill. Jimmy understood the feeling completely. 20 minutes later, headlights cut through the driving rain, and Jimmy heard the rumble of a diesel engine that could only belong to one vehicle in Millbrook. Eleanor Thornton's ancient but indestructible 1995 Ford pickup. The woman had learned to drive farm equipment during the Depression and had never met a piece of machinery she couldn't operate. Jimmy grabbed his emergency bag, a habit left over from military service, and clipped Kaiser's leash to his collar. "Come on, boy. Looks like we're getting rescued whether we like it or not." The journey to Millbrook Methodist Church took 15 minutes that felt like hours. Eleanor drove with the calm competence of someone who'd navigated farm roads in worse conditions than this, but even her steady hands couldn't completely compensate for wind gusts that pushed her truck sideways across the center line. Kaiser rode in the passenger seat with his head pressed against Jimmy's chest, drawing comfort from physical contact while simultaneously providing it. Through the truck's rain-streaked windshield, Jimmy watched Millbrook transform from a sleepy small town into something resembling a war zone. Traffic lights swayed at impossible angles. Storefront awnings flapped like wounded birds. The Little Tennessee River, normally a lazy brown creek, was already beginning to overflow its banks. "Haven't seen weather like this since 1974, Eleanor said, raising her voice above the wind's howl. "That storm took down half the county and left us without power for 3 weeks. But we rebuilt, same as always." The church shelter was a revelation of small-town efficiency and compassion. Eleanor had somehow managed to transform the fellowship hall into a refuge that accommodated 37 people, including 6 other dogs, 2 cats, and Mrs. Patterson's elderly rooster that refused to be separated from his owner. Cots were arranged in family groupings, with privacy screens borrowed from the hospital. Volunteers from the Ladies' Auxiliary had prepared enough food to feed a small army, and the church's backup generator provided enough power for essential lighting and communication. True to her word, Eleanor had reserved a small room behind the kitchen for Jimmy and Kaiser, a space normally used for storing folding chairs, but now equipped with a cot, battery-powered lanterns, and most importantly, a door that could be closed against the chaos of the main shelter. "This work for you two?" Eleanor asked, setting down a thermos of coffee and a bowl of water for Kaiser. Jimmy looked around the small space and felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Genuine gratitude mixed with the uncomfortable realization that he'd been wrong to try facing this alone. "This is perfect, Mrs. Thornton. I don't know how to thank you." Eleanor's smile was gentle but firm. "You thank me by taking care of that dog and letting him take care of you. And Jimmy, next time someone offers help, maybe don't be so quick to turn it down." As the night deepened and the storm reached its full intensity, Jimmy found himself thinking about Eleanor's words. He'd spent so long believing that accepting help was weakness, that real men faced their problems alone, that he'd nearly forgotten the military principle that had kept him alive in Afghanistan. No one survives without their team. Kaiser seemed to sense his shifting thoughts. The dog had settled onto the blanket beside Jimmy's cot, but his position was protective rather than passive, close enough to provide comfort, alert enough to respond if threats emerged. Around midnight, when the storm's fury was at its peak and the church's walls shook with each wind gust, Jimmy realized that he was experiencing something he'd thought lost forever. A sense of belonging to a community that cared about his survival. It was a feeling that would prove crucial in the hours ahead, when Hurricane Delilah revealed just how much danger was hidden in Millbrook's quiet streets. The emergency radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m. with news that made Jimmy's blood turn to ice water. Multiple residents reported missing in the Riverside Mobile Home Park area. Floodwaters from Little Tennessee River have exceeded all previous records. Emergency responders unable to reach affected areas due to road closures and downed power lines. Eleanor Thornton was already awake, moving through the shelter with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. She found Jimmy sitting upright on his cot, Kaiser alert beside him, both of them listening to the radio dispatcher's increasingly desperate reports. "Jimmy, I need to tell you something," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My neighbor Dolores Whitman lives in Riverside Park. She's 84 years old, deaf in one ear and stubborn as a Missouri mule. She refused evacuation yesterday, said she'd weathered worse storms in that trailer." Jimmy was already reaching for his boots. "Where exactly is her place?" "Lot 47, the blue single-wide with the flower boxes. Jimmy, the radio said water levels are at 15 feet and rising. That whole area is underwater." Kaiser had risen to his feet the moment Jimmy started moving, the dog's posture shifting into work mode with an alertness that spoke of extensive emergency training. His dark eyes fixed on Jimmy with the kind of focus that said he understood they were about to undertake something dangerous and necessary. Eleanor gripped Jimmy's arm as he stood. "You can't go out there. The roads are impassable. And even if you could reach Riverside, how would you find her in this mess?" Jimmy looked down at Kaiser, who was already positioned by the door in the ready stance of a search and rescue animal. "I won't be going alone." The argument that followed was brief but intense. Eleanor insisted the professional rescue teams would handle the situation. Jimmy pointed out that those teams were already overwhelmed and might not reach Dolores in time. Other shelter residents gathered around, voicing opinions that ranged from "let the authorities handle it" to "somebody's got to do something." It was Dr. Sarah Coleman who ended the debate. She'd been monitoring emergency communications on her veterinary clinic's radio system and had information the others lacked. "The National Guard unit that was supposed to handle water rescues is stuck on the far side of the county," she said. 3 of their boats are out of commission, and they won't reach Riverside until dawn at the earliest. If this woman is trapped in rising water, she doesn't have that long." Jimmy was already pulling on his rain gear, military surplus that had served him through worse conditions than this. "Kaiser and I know search patterns. We can find her." "In the dark." "In a flood?" Eleanor's voice carried the anguish of someone who'd already lost too many people she cared about. "Ma'am, that dog's been trained for exactly this kind of work. And I've done night operations in worse conditions." Jimmy clipped Kaiser's working harness, a piece of equipment he'd purchased with his last $20 after recognizing the dog's professional background. "Sometimes you can't wait for the perfect solution. Sometimes you just have to act." Dr. Coleman stepped forward. "I'm coming with you. If we find her, she'll likely need medical attention." "Sarah, no," Eleanor began. "Eleanor, I'm a veterinarian, but I've got EMT training from my volunteer firefighter days. And somebody needs to document this officially if we're going to help other people in similar situations." The journey to Riverside Mobile Home Park took 45 minutes through conditions that would have challenged an armored vehicle. Jimmy drove his pickup through water that sometimes reached the wheel wells, navigating by memory and the occasional glimpse of familiar landmarks when lightning illuminated the landscape. Kaiser rode in the passenger seat, his nose pressed to the window, processing scents and sounds that human senses couldn't detect. Twice he alerted to something beyond Jimmy's perception, and both times Jimmy found alternate routes around obstacles, a fallen tree, a washed-out culvert that would have stopped them dead. When they finally reached the flooded trailer park, the scene was apocalyptic. Water stretched as far as Jimmy's flashlight could penetrate, broken only by the tops of submerged vehicles and the occasional trailer roof. Debris floated everywhere. Propane tanks, furniture, personal belongings that represented someone's entire life. "Lot 47, Dr. Coleman said, consulting the map Eleanor had drawn for them. "Should be about 200 yards northeast of that overturned mobile home." Jimmy was about to respond when Kaiser suddenly went rigid, his head snapping toward a sound Jimmy couldn't hear above the storm's noise. The dog's body language was unmistakable. He'd found something. "He's got a scent," Jimmy said, grabbing the emergency rope from his truck bed. "Sarah, stay close and follow my lead. Kaiser, show me." The German Shepherd leaped into the floodwater without hesitation, his powerful swimming stroke carrying him toward a trailer that was listing badly to one side, water lapping at its windows. From inside came a sound that made Jimmy's heart race, the weak but persistent tapping of someone trying to signal for help. Dolores Whitman was alive, but the trailer was sinking, and they had minutes before the situation became irretrievable. The rescue should have been straightforward. Kaiser had located Dolores Whitman trapped in her flooding trailer, Jimmy had the rope and emergency equipment, and Dr. Coleman was there to provide medical support. What none of them had anticipated was that Dolores would refuse to leave. "I'm not abandoning my home!" The elderly woman's voice carried clearly through the trailer's thin walls, even above the storm's howling. 43 years I've lived here, 43 years. You think a little water's going to scare me out?" Jimmy treaded water outside her kitchen window, fighting against the current that wanted to sweep him downstream. The trailer was listing at a dangerous angle, taking on water through gaps in the foundation skirting. At the current rate, the entire structure would be submerged within an hour. "Mrs. Whitman, my name is Jimmy Patterson. I'm here with a doctor and a search dog." "The water's still rising, and this trailer isn't going to stay afloat much longer." "Well, then I guess I'll go down with my ship, young man. I've seen floods before. Water goes up, water goes down. Always has, always will." Dr. Coleman swam closer to Jimmy, her medical bag sealed in a waterproof container strapped to her back. "She's probably hypothermic," she said quietly. "Elderly people lose core body temperature quickly in conditions like this. It affects judgment, makes them stubborn and confused." Kaiser had been circling the trailer, using his nose to assess the structural damage. Now he swam directly to Jimmy and nudged his arm, a signal that meant the situation was more urgent than it appeared. The dog's behavior suggested he could detect something human senses were missing. "What is it, boy?" Jimmy followed Kaiser's gaze to the trailer's foundation. In the beam of his waterproof flashlight, he could see that the support pillars were shifting with each wave. The entire structure was about to collapse. "Mrs. Whitman, we need to get you out right now. Not in 10 minutes, not when the storm passes. Right now." "Don't you take that tone with me, young man. I changed diapers older than you." Jimmy looked at Dr. Coleman with frustration that bordered on desperation. They couldn't physically force an elderly woman to leave her home, but they also couldn't stand by and watch her die from misguided stubbornness. That's when Kaiser made the decision for them. The German Shepherd swam directly to the trailer's front door, or rather to where the door would be if it weren't 3 feet underwater. Without hesitation, he dove beneath the surface and disappeared into the flooded interior. "Kaiser, no!" Jimmy shouted. But the dog was already gone. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, there was only silence, broken by wind and rain. Then, from inside the trailer, came sounds that made Jimmy's heart race. barking, splashing, and most encouragingly, a woman's voice saying, "Well, hello there, handsome. Where did you come from?" "Mrs. Whitman?" Jimmy called. "Are you all right? There's a dog in here with me. Beautiful German Shepherd. Looks like he's been through some hard times. He keeps nudging me toward the door, like he wants me to follow him somewhere." Dr. Coleman understood immediately. She'll listen to the dog. Animals don't lie, and elderly people know that. Kaiser's establishing trust. From inside the trailer came more conversation, one-sided, as Dolores talked to Kaiser like he was an old friend. "You want me to go outside, don't you? In all this water? I suppose you know something I don't." Jimmy heard movement, furniture being pushed aside, and the distinctive sound of someone wading through knee-deep water. Then Kaiser's head appeared at the window, followed by Dolores, a tiny woman with white hair plastered to her scalp and eyes that held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd survived 8 decades through wit and determination. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, looking around at the flooded landscape. "This is worse than I thought." Getting Dolores from the window to safety required every bit of Jimmy's military training and Kaiser's instinctive understanding of water rescue procedures. The dog positioned himself as an anchor point, while Jimmy used his rope to create a makeshift pulley system, allowing Dr. Coleman to guide the elderly woman into a life jacket and then into the relative safety of deeper water where she could be towed to Jimmy's truck. But the rescue was only the beginning of their problems. As they helped Dolores into the pickup's cab, Kaiser suddenly went rigid, his ears swiveling toward a sound Jimmy couldn't identify above the storm noise. The dog's alert posture meant immediate danger, but Jimmy couldn't determine the source. "What is it now?" Dr. Coleman asked, following Kaiser's gaze across the flooded trailer park. The answer came as a deep, resonant crack that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Somewhere in the darkness, something large and structural was giving way. The sound was followed by rushing water, not the steady flow of flood runoff, but the concentrated torrent of a dam failure or levee breach. "The retention pond," Dolores said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "The county built it upstream 20 years ago to prevent flooding. If that dam goes—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jimmy could see the implications clearly. A wall of water moving downstream at speeds that would make their current flood look like a gentle creek overflow. Anyone still trapped in the low-lying areas would have minutes to reach higher ground or face certain death. "How many people are still down there?" Jimmy asked. "Could be dozens. A lot of folks were too stubborn or too poor to evacuate, just like me." Jimmy looked at Kaiser, who was already moving toward the truck's tailgate. The dog's body language was unmistakable. He knew there was more work to do, more people who needed saving, and he was ready to continue despite his own exhaustion and the worsening conditions. Dr. Coleman was thinking along the same lines. "We need to get word to the emergency coordinators. If there are more people trapped down there, they need to know about the dam failure." But Jimmy was studying the topographic layout of the area, his military training automatically calculating escape routes and tactical options. The retention pond was 2 miles upstream. Depending on how much water was being released, they had perhaps 20 minutes before the surge reached the lowest areas of Riverside Park. 20 minutes to save however many people were still trapped in their homes, still believing their aluminum and particle board shelters could protect them from the full fury of nature unleashed. "Kaiser," Jimmy said, checking his equipment one more time. "You ready for another mission?" The German Shepherd's answer was to leap into the floodwater without hesitation, already swimming toward the sounds of human distress that carried across the dark water like prayers offered to an indifferent sky. This time they weren't just racing against the storm, they were racing against time itself, and the margin for error had just dropped to 0. 3 hours after the dam failed, when the floodwaters had finally begun to recede and the body count should have been in the dozens, Millbrook County found itself with a miracle it couldn't explain. Every single person in Riverside Mobile Home Park had been accounted for, alive and breathing. The final tally was staggering. Jimmy and Kaiser had rescued 17 people from 9 different trailers, working in conditions that should have been fatal for both human and dog. Each rescue had followed the same pattern. Kaiser would locate trapped residents using scent detection that defied explanation. Jimmy would coordinate the extraction using military precision, and Dr. Coleman would provide immediate medical care for hypothermia, injuries, and panic attacks. But the miracle came at a cost that Jimmy was only beginning to understand as he sat in the emergency medical tent at Millbrook High School, watching a veterinary technician examine Kaiser's injuries. "The good news is that nothing's broken," Dr. Coleman said, her voice professionally calm despite the exhaustion etched into her features. "The bad news is that he's reopened the old shrapnel wounds in his rear leg, and he's showing signs of severe physical stress. His body temperature dropped dangerously low during the last rescue." Kaiser lay on the examination table with the patient stillness of an animal accustomed to medical procedures, but Jimmy could see the pain in his eyes. The dog had given everything he had to save people he'd never met, and now he was paying the price for heroism that should have earned him a medal instead of more suffering. "How bad is it really?" Jimmy asked. Dr. Coleman exchanged a look with the veterinary technician before answering. "Bad enough that he needs surgery to repair the damage. The shrapnel fragments have shifted, and there's internal bleeding that won't stop on its own." Without proper treatment, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Jimmy had seen enough combat wounds to understand the implications. Kaiser had saved 17 lives, but the effort might cost him his own. "How much?" Jimmy's voice was barely above a whisper. "The surgery itself would be around $8,000. Post-operative care, medications, physical therapy. We're looking at close to $12,000 total." Jimmy closed his eyes, the weight of mathematical impossibility settling over him like a burial shroud. He had less than $300 to his name, no credit worth mentioning, and no family wealthy enough to help, even if he'd been willing to ask. Kaiser had earned a hero's treatment, but Jimmy couldn't provide it. "There has to be something," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Payment plans, charity programs, something." Dr. Coleman's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "Jimmy, I wish there was. I really do. But this kind of specialized surgery requires equipment and expertise that costs money we simply don't have in our budget for charity cases." The words hit Jimmy like physical blows. Charity case. That's what they were. A broke veteran and his damaged dog. Objects of pity rather than partners deserving respect and care. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. Kaiser had just performed feats that would earn a human rescuer national recognition, but because he was just a dog owned by just a veteran, his life was measured in dollars Jimmy couldn't afford. "I need some air," Jimmy said, standing abruptly. Kaiser tried to follow, but Dr. Coleman gently restrained him. "Let him rest. He's earned it." Outside the medical tent, Jimmy found himself surrounded by the controlled chaos of a disaster response operation. National Guard trucks were arriving with supplies and personnel, emergency management officials were coordinating recovery efforts, and news crews were setting up for broadcasts that would reduce the night's heroics to sound bites and human interest stories. That's when he saw Marcus "Tank" Williams standing beside a military surplus Humvee, deep in conversation with 2 men in civilian clothes who carried themselves like federal agents or senior military officers. Tank spotted Jimmy and broke away from the conversation, walking over with an expression that Jimmy couldn't read. "Hell of a thing you and that dog did tonight," Tank said without preamble. "Yeah, well, heroes don't come cheap. Turns out saving lives is expensive when you're not getting paid for it." Tank studied Jimmy for a long moment, his weathered features revealing nothing of his thoughts. "You think I sold you damaged goods, don't you? Think I cheated you out of $10 for a broken-down old dog? I think you sold me the best damn partner I've ever had, and now I can't afford to keep him alive. What if I told you that wasn't an accident?" Jimmy turned to face Tank fully, something in the older man's tone demanding complete attention. "What do you mean?" Tank glanced back toward the two men by the Humvee, then seemed to make a decision that had been weighing on him for months. "That dog's name isn't Kaiser, it's Ghost. Serial number K4587739. Attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment deployed to Afghanistan from 2018 to 2021. He saved 43 lives in combat operations before he went missing during Operation Desert Shield." The words hit Jimmy like incoming artillery. He'd suspected Kaiser was a former military working dog, but this level of detail suggested something far more complex than a simple adoption gone wrong. "How do you know all that?" "Because I was his trainer. Ghost and I worked together for 3 years before he deployed with the Rangers. That dog was the best I'd ever trained, smart, fearless, completely dedicated to his mission. When he went missing, I was told he'd been killed in action. End of story. Case closed." Jimmy felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. But he wasn't killed. No, he wasn't. He was captured by Taliban forces, held for 8 months, then sold through black market channels to dealers who specialize in moving high-value animals across international borders. By the time I tracked him down, he'd been through hell: malnutrition, untreated injuries, psychological trauma that would have broken most dogs. "So you bought him back?" Tank's expression hardened. "I tried to. Spent every penny I had and borrowed money I couldn't afford to pay back. But the dealer wanted more than money. He wanted assurance that Ghost would never be connected back to his original identity. So I agreed to take him and find him a new life, a new identity, a fresh start." Jimmy stared at Tank, pieces of a larger puzzle finally clicking into place. "You've been looking for the right handler. For 6 months, I've been evaluating every veteran who showed interest in that dog. Most of them wanted a pet, something to make them feel better about their own problems. You were the first one who saw him for what he really was. A warrior who deserved respect, not pity." The implications of Tank's revelation were staggering, but Jimmy focused on the immediate crisis. "That doesn't change the fact that he needs surgery I can't afford." Tank smiled for the first time since Jimmy had known him. "Son, Ghost is still technically government property, and the government takes care of its own. The revelation that Ghost was government property should have solved everything. Instead, it created complications that Jimmy hadn't anticipated and Tank clearly hadn't thought through completely. The two men in civilian clothes turned out to be Colonel Marcus Reed from the Department of Defense's Military Working Dog Program and Agent Patricia Hawkins from the Department of Agriculture's Animal Welfare Division. Their presence at a small-town flood response wasn't coincidental. They'd been tracking Ghost for months, following a paper trail that led from black market animal dealers in Eastern Europe to Tank's well-intentioned but technically illegal rescue operation. "Mr. Patterson," Colonel Reed said, extending his hand in a greeting that felt more like an interrogation opening, "we need to discuss the animal you've been harboring." "Harboring?" Jimmy's temper flared despite his exhaustion. "That dog just saved 17 lives in conditions that would have killed most humans." "If that's harboring, then charge me." Agent Hawkins consulted her tablet before responding. "According to our records, K4587739 was declared killed in action on March 15, 2021. Legally speaking, that animal doesn't exist. Any claims about his service record or government ownership are complicated by his official status." Dr. Coleman emerged from the medical tent at that moment, her timing either fortunate or disastrous depending on perspective. "Jimmy, we need to make a decision about Ghost's surgery. His condition is deteriorating." Colonel Reed's eyebrows rose. You've confirmed his identity? The microchip scan was conclusive. This is definitely the dog from the military records, though how he ended up in Tennessee is beyond my expertise. What followed was a bureaucratic nightmare that would have been comedic if Ghost's life hadn't hung in the balance. The military claimed jurisdiction over a dog they'd declared dead. The Agriculture Department wanted to investigate potential violations of international animal trafficking laws. Tank faced federal charges for knowingly transporting stolen government property across state lines, and Jimmy found himself caught in the middle, watching his partner's condition worsen while officials debated legal technicalities. It was Eleanor Thornton who cut through the bureaucratic nonsense with the kind of moral clarity that comes from 8 decades of watching institutional stupidity triumph over common sense. "Gentlemen," she said, approaching the group with the authoritative bearing of someone who'd raised 6 children and buried a husband after 52 years of marriage, "I don't give a damn about your paperwork or your jurisdictional disputes. That dog is dying while you argue about who owns him. In my book, heroes don't belong to governments. They belong to the people they save." She turned to address the small crowd that had gathered around the medical tent, refugees from the flood who owed their lives to Ghost's courage and Jimmy's determination. "How many of you are alive right now because of what that dog did tonight?" Hands rose throughout the crowd. Dolores Whitman stepped forward, despite her blanket-wrapped frailty. "That animal pulled me out of my trailer when I was too stubborn to save myself. Far as I'm concerned, he's earned the right to live however and wherever he chooses." Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of testimony that transformed Ghost from government property into community hero. The political dynamics shifted dramatically when local news crews arrived and began broadcasting live footage of federal agents debating the fate of a flood rescue dog while he lay dying from injuries sustained, saving human lives. Within 2 hours, Eleanor had organized something that Tank would later describe as the most effective grassroots campaign he'd ever witnessed. The Millbrook Methodist Church's phone tree activated every congregation member within 50 miles. Social media posts with hashtags like Save Ghost and Heroes Aren't Property went viral across Tennessee and beyond. The local VFW Post launched a fundraising drive that raised $4,000 in the first hour. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Staff Sergeant Michael Williams, Tank's son, calling from his army base in Germany. "Dad, I'm watching the news coverage here, and I need you to know something about Ghost that's not in his official records." Michael's voice came through the satellite phone with military clarity, despite the distance. "That dog didn't just serve with the Rangers. He was part of a classified program training military working dogs to assist veterans with PTSD. Ghost was specifically trained for medical alert and psychiatric service work." The implications hit Jimmy like lightning. Ghost's uncanny ability to sense his flashbacks, the precise timing of his interventions, the way he seemed to anticipate Jimmy's needs. It hadn't been coincidence or natural instinct. It had been professional training worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in specialized programs. Colonel Reed's expression changed dramatically as he absorbed this information. "If that's accurate, then this animal represents a significant military investment in veteran care programs." "More than that," Michael continued. "The program was experimental, designed to provide service dogs for veterans who couldn't afford civilian alternatives. Ghost was supposed to be paired with a PTSD veteran after his combat deployment. When he went missing, they scrapped the entire program because they couldn't replace his level of training." Tank looked at Jimmy with something approaching reverence. "That's why you two connected so fast. He was literally trained for you." Dr. Coleman's voice cut through the revelation with medical urgency. "This is all fascinating, but Ghost needs surgery now. We've delayed as long as we can." What happened next would become Millbrook legend. Colonel Reed made a phone call that lasted exactly 90 seconds. When he hung up, his official demeanor had been replaced by something approaching humanity. The Department of Defense is officially reinstating K458-7739 to active service as a retired military working dog assigned to Veteran Support Services. All medical expenses will be covered by Military Veterinary Services, and Mr. Patterson is hereby designated as his official handler with full benefits and support. The crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard 3 blocks away. Eleanor Thornton hugged Tank so hard she nearly knocked him over. Dr. Coleman was already on her phone, arranging for Ghost to be transported to the Military Veterinary Hospital at Fort Campbell, where specialists waited with equipment and expertise that would ensure his full recovery. But for Jimmy, the moment crystallized around something simpler and more profound. As Ghost was loaded into the medical transport vehicle, the dog's eyes found his across the crowd. In that gaze, Jimmy saw not just trust and loyalty, but recognition of a bond that transcended ownership, paperwork, or bureaucratic categories. They were partners in the truest sense, 2 warriors who'd found each other against impossible odds and discovered that healing was possible when you had someone worth fighting for. The transport pulled away with lights flashing, carrying Ghost toward surgery and recovery. Jimmy stood watching until the red taillights disappeared into the night, knowing that when they were reunited, both of them would be whole in ways they'd never been before. Sometimes miracles came disguised as $10 dogs and small-town stubbornness. Sometimes they came wrapped in bureaucratic red tape and military precision. But they always came when they were needed most, and they always arrived exactly when hope seemed lost forever. Sometimes, life's greatest blessings come in the most unexpected packages. For those of you who've lived long enough to know that second chances are precious gifts, you understand that love doesn't always arrive when we expect it, but it always shows up when we need it most. Whether it's a neighbor checking on us during a storm, a community rallying around a cause, or even a 4-legged friend who sees past our broken places to the hero still inside us, these connections remind us that we're never too old to matter, never too broken to heal, and never too late to find our purpose. The greatest adventures don't end at retirement. Sometimes they're just beginning. What unexpected blessing has walked into your life when you needed it most? Have you ever found yourself being the answer to someone else's prayer without realizing it? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.